Good afternoon. My name is Barbara Pavarnik, and I'd like to start by taking a moment. Let's take a moment of silence to promote peace in Hartford and peace in the world. Thank you. So today we're here with Eric Stamm, a clinical social worker in Hartford for the past 20 years and counting, and a longtime peace activist who will speak about the history and present day activities and events of Hope Out Loud. So welcome, Eric.
Good to be here.
Can you share, Eric, some of your family story and early involvement with the peace movement?
Yeah, I was blessed to be raised in an activist family. My father was a German Jewish refugee from World War II. My mother and her family were devastated by the Great Depression, so both my parents were very much aware of and active in progressive social change, the peace movement. So when I arrived here, so I was raised basically to be an activist.
Okay.
And when I arrived here, my parents had moved a couple years before I moved up here in 2001. My father was very connected to the Catholic Worker House. Now, I was raised in a Quaker family, so besides the Quaker meeting, American Friends Service Committee, he also got close to the Catholic Worker and began insisting that I go with him to the Friday Vigil. We'll talk about that a bit later, but Catholic Worker had started a Friday Vigil. And
how great to have unity, right, with sort of religious conflict, but religious unity there, the Quaker household and working with the Catholic Worker. So following September 11th, obviously a critical time in our nation and the world, Hope Out Loud held its first rally in Bushnell Park. Can you tell us about the beginning of Hope Out Loud there during those times?
Like I said, I moved up here in March of 2001, and my father was working with a group that had been organized by the Connecticut Office of American Friends Service Committee on the Stop Star Wars in Space campaign.
Okay.
It's meant to be a national campaign focused on preventing the militarization of space. And we're meeting every Monday night at the Quaker Meeting House to do our work, and then 9/11 happened in 2001. And instead of 7 or 8 of us showing up at Quaker Meeting House, I think over 60 people arrived that Monday. Just in shock over what had happened and out of concern that there would be, what did happen, a military response to those events. We had scheduled actually a rally to stop Star Wars in space on the steps of the Capitol, I believe for October 16th. In the days after 9/11, they immediately passed legislation authorizing Star Wars in space, so that issue became moot. But we had the permit for the rally, so we made it a call for a non-military response to the events of 9/11. We needed to really use this to show that violence really doesn't work. Over the course of the year, of course, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan, and there were increasing indication we were preparing for war in Iraq. As Americans, peace activists were equally affected by the destruction of the World Trade Center. I actually volunteered in the pit with a...
Wow. You lived in New York, didn't you? Yeah, you were
I
a
was
New Yorker
living in New
for a
York,
while.
but I volunteered, and we were affected by it, and we organized the Hope Out Loud. We didn't call it a peace festival because it wasn't appropriate to call it a festival at that time, but a peace gathering around September 11th on a Sunday in September. In 2002, we held the first one.
So for the past 20 years, Hope Out Loud has really reached out, and we saw that in the video as well, to various community organizations and businesses here in Hartford to participate in very successful peace gatherings and rallies. Can you share some of those memories with us, Eric, as maybe some stories how that contributed to the peace movement here?
Okay, well, you know, in the early 2000s, there actually was in central Connecticut a very active peace movement calling for an end to the Iraq War and Afghanistan wars. And Hope Out Loud, which we really were part of what we called the Connecticut Coalition for Peace and Justice at that point, we really were core organizers in many of the anti-war rallies and marches that were held during that period. We worked with Connecticut United for Peace, which was really a broad coalition of central Connecticut peace groups. And I believe probably the biggest was at the old State House. The Connecticut Opposes the War actually organized a rally where about 1,200 people arrived.
Wow. Yeah, obviously a large commitment and a large following, and really affecting people, I think, giving us things to think about that normally wouldn't be at the forefront. You know, I was looking at the mission and the vision of Hope Out Loud as I was preparing for our conversation. And it seems like we have, and I think you've talked to me about the 4 aspects of peace that Hope Out Loud kind of signifies. The first, nonviolence, obviously, as a response. And so the relationship to the Quaker community, I think you've touched on that, but
you know, Quakers in 1650 adopted something called the Peace Testimony. I'm wrong. 1660, where we renounced use of weapons for violence, for any reason whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, a lot of the activism in my family and in my life comes from Quaker roots. I'm forgetting where we're going with this.
Yes, no, that's right. So that really led very much into the second part, the aspect of the mission, which is social justice. Of course, it's a word that we use frequently about the where we like to go forward in the world and in the city. And so I think this tied somewhat into the Friday Vigil, this idea of social justice in front of the federal courthouse.
Oh, the federal courthouse, that Friday Vigil, Brian Kavanaugh of Hartford Catholic Worker, delightful man, used the term that they started it in 1995 to provide an opportunity for public nonviolent witness. Similar to Hope Out Loud, where we see peace as much more than just the absence of war, but really an active process with 4 prongs. Very active process. It requires resources commensurate with what we're investing in the military. But yes, learning how to resolve conflict both personally in our communities and in our globally. How to do it without the resorting to violence.
Absolutely, and I think you kind of led into, when we were looking at those 4 aspects, that the third aspect was economic equity, and how we support initiatives in the community responding to the issues we all know about, poverty and justice.
I think it was Mahatma Gandhi who said, poverty is the highest form of violence.
I forgot
you
that.
really can't have peace. Again, peace is more than the absence of war. Can't have peace without social justice, people being treated as equals, without a level of economic equity. You know, when 0.5% of the people control close to 50% of the world's resources, that means a large number of people don't have access to enough resources. And while it's appropriate to have a range of income and control of resources, the current economic situation where literally you have large numbers of people who are experiencing food insecurity,
even
housing insecurity, in one of the richest countries in the history of the world, illustrates that, you know,
something is not
the system isn't working. People talk, you know, is our economy working? And that usually is the stock market up? Are the banks making profits? Are corporations making profits? I would postulate we need to start asking, is the economy working based on, is the population housed? Is the population fed? Is health care available to everyone? Social justice, economic equity. The fourth real prong of peace that we talk about is environmental sustainability.
Right, and how would you kind of tie that into like climate change and?
Well, one, you know, peace work. If you know about environmental racism, that's a wonderful example where heavily polluting industries tend to be placed in minority neighborhoods.
Yeah, I really enlarge about that comment, yeah.
Is an example of environmental sustainability. We need to be able to survive as a species to have peace, A. Secondly, our economic structure is really based on expansion.
In what way? Yeah.
Well, that a company that makes the same amount of money this year is not, as last year, is not successful. They need to constantly be growing.
I see.
Expanding so that the stock market investors make money. We need to move that economy over to a sustainability model.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And that kind of brings us, I think, when we're talking about the environment, to a major focus that I've been involved in with you in recent months and actually throughout the year was advocating for the abolition of nuclear weapons. And maybe you could start with the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Just like tell us more about that treaty.
2021, the UN approved the treaty on the abolition of nuclear weapons. And well over 100 countries have now signed on, and it really calls for the elimination of nuclear weapons. Similar to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Article 6 of that, which we are a signatory, called on the nuclear armed states to dismantle and eliminate their weapons, which we really have. We're doing the opposite and building a new generation of nuclear weapons now. But yeah, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, one of the weaknesses is that none of the nuclear armed states have signed on to it.
Why haven't they?
No one wants to give up their weapons. You know, military might. I remember meeting recently with one of our congressmen to advocate for this, and the response was we need to maintain our deterrence capability. Well, if everybody needs to maintain deterrence, the world is at risk. I mean, the impact of even a limited nuclear exchange would probably collapse human society as we know it.
How does this, I was just going to say, absolutely. And how does that play into the fear people have in general, this idea of fear?
For myself, nuclear weapons became very much a background issue. You know, during the 50s and 60s, it was the precursor to the peace movement. But then it seemed like with the various non-proliferation treaty, the Fresh Start treaties, it seemed like we were making progress, and no one really thought, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, I know I wasn't that worried about nuclear conflict. And then 2 years ago with Russia invading Ukraine, Putin actually indicated that they were not off the table.
Really?
And all of a sudden it became much more of an imminent risk. And I hope out loud, actually, and it's a great privilege of organizing Hartford's annual, or being the lead organizer of Hartford's annual Hiroshima Nagasaki Remembrance and Shared Call for Nuclear Weapon Abolition.
Yeah, I was there this year, and I know you've had a long history of doing that remembrance.
When I say we're honored by it, when I first attended one of them in 2001, I'd moved up here. Some of the old timers at the time told me that they'd been coming to these for 30 years. Now that was in 2001, so we've got at least 50 years, and I suspect it really goes back to the 50s, late 50s SANE movement, the Ban the Bomb movement. Hartford's had an annual observance on August 6th, so it's a real privilege to have inherited being one of the lead organizers of that event.
Yeah, I think the idea of privilege in memory is so important to remember with humility kind of what our role is now. And I think Hope Out Loud has really, as you said, been a leader, and as you have. Recent letters have been inviting legislators to help pass HRES, House Resolution 77. So can you talk a little bit, because about House Resolution 77?
Okay, in January of this year, Representative Jim McGovern, Democrat of Massachusetts, and Representative Earl, Blumenauer, Democrat of Oregon, introduced House Resolution 77 that basically calls for us, the U.S., to begin to take the lead in negotiations with Russia and China to reduce nuclear stockpiles and move towards coming in compliance with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It also calls for elimination of commitment to no first use of nuclear weapons and the president not having sole authority to launch them.
Yeah, so important. Yeah.
So we got involved, really, a peace ship called the Golden Rule.
Yeah,
Again,
tell us
a
about,
link to the Quakers.
yeah.
In 1958, 4 Quakers attempted to sail a 29-foot, not 35-foot boat into the Marshall Islands site of a nuclear weapon test. They were stopped, but the publicity that sprang out from that really was a catalyst for the Ban the Bomb movement of the late 50s, early 60s.
That part of that was a relationship, this Golden Rule, with Veterans for Peace, correct?
Well, not originally. That was really
Not
a
originally,
Quaker
later.
project. In 2010,
Right.
a group of California's Veterans for Peace tracked down the Golden Rule, found out it had sunk, and in conjunction with some of the local Quakers and other peace activists, they actually raised it, got the funds to rebuild the boat, and Veterans for Peace have been sailing it first along the west coast out to Hawaii, and then starting in 2022, they did down the Mississippi River from Minnesota, dropped by Cuba, and then up the east coast, stopping in ports along the way to promote nuclear weapon abolition. We were very active in working for Vets for Peace. Really, I think the Hope Out Loud group took the lead in organizing the Hartford events around
Yeah.
the visit of the Golden Rule.
And I think there were some significant events. I know I was working with you, and maybe talk about how
I'm
obtained.
very pleased to say that the Hartford City Council passed a resolution supporting the Golden Rule. Largely, that was those activists here in Hartford. Thank you, Marilyn Rossetti, for that.
Yeah,
She
thank
really
you, Marilyn. Yeah,
took the
amazing.
lead in jockeying that through the council and immediately supported it when we approached her. Matt Ritter's office got us a statewide citation from the Connecticut State Assembly supporting the mission
incredible.
of the Golden Rule. I know activists in New Haven, the mayor issued a proclamation supporting it. The mayor of Middletown issued a proclamation supporting it. So Connecticut really was active in welcoming it, and I'm pleased to say Hope Out Loud took the lead here in Hartford.
Yeah, that's, we're so grateful for that. I was just reading just a quote by Pope Francis, which I think echoes Hope Out Loud's mission as well, and the nuclear war conflict, which gives rise, obviously, we have talked about, to the fears of uncontrollable consequences worldwide, which you alluded to, Eric. So in response, Hope Out Loud then takes, and it continues to take, concrete actions to call attention to the war. I'd probably like to end with just some personal hopes you have as one of the activist leaders in our city, how we go forth during this really tough time.
One, I want to encourage people. I love being an activist. Do something. Don't just sit and talk about this is wrong, that's wrong. Call up your elected officials. Advocate for what you believe in. Join us at the vigils. We have a vigil every Friday in Hartford on Main Street in front of the Federal Building from 11:30 to 12:30. That's been going on since 1995.
And of course, Hope Out Loud, the coffee house.
Oh, we'll get
Please.
to that. No, the vigil, the West Hartford vigil. In West Hartford from noon to 1 every Saturday at the intersection of Farmington Avenue and Main Street. We've had a vigil, we organized that I think in 2002. And finally, every month, Hope Out Loud sponsors an open mic, coffee house and open mic at the Hartford Quaker Meeting, 144 South Quaker Lane, last Friday of the month, starting at 7 p.m., which is just an opportunity. One, free speech is encouraged, but bringing together activists to do the important networking and relationship building that, especially in the era of Zoom, is kind of getting lost.
Absolutely. And I know I attended that last meeting before the fall began again, and it was very encouraging to meet new people and to have an inclusive openness to poetry and writing and song, and it was a great place to gather for peace. So
yeah, it's largely poetry. We have poets, we have mainly acoustics, folk type music, although some people show up with their electric guitars. And then just, it's an open mic, so often people get up and either read stories or talk about their political views, their concerns about the world
yeah,
today.
thank God we're all able to do that. And so thank you for all of us joining us today, and thank you especially, Eric, for your leadership and hard work and commitment, obviously, to the mission of Hope Out Loud. May Hope Out Loud continue to be a beacon of light and an unrelentless advocate for peace and nonviolence in our community. So we will now end with another moment of silence. So let us remember the civilian casualties of war and all areas of conflict around the world. Let peace prevail in the world, in our hearts. And together we'll sit in silence for a minute.